Hi everyone, it's Jamie and welcome back to my channel. I was really hoping the next video on this channel would be Halloween themed, but something has come up in the Sims community and I just wanted to make a video just kind of discussing it. Before we get into this topic, I do want to warn you, it's gonna be a little bit more of a serious video. We're going to be discussing the recent controversy regarding the upcoming Sims 4 expansion pack, Snowy Escape. Before we get into this, I do want to say I am by no means the main voice that you should be listening to. My opinions here you should take with a grain of salt, I guess. Essentially, we're going to be talking about some issues regarding some heavy topics such as colonialism and how they're being presented in some ways in The Sims 4. So for those who don't know, because I haven't seen too many Simmers discuss this as of this moment, as well as I've seen there's a blog post on the simscommunity.info website. And essentially we're going to be discussing this little controversy, if you want to call it that. I kind of feel weird calling it a controversy because I think it kind of gives the wrong impression. But let's kind of take a step back. So before we can really get into what the controversy is, I think we need to go over some basic history. This is by no means like a super in-depth look into history, but rather meant to just kind of offer some context. It's going to be a little basic level. If you want to know more, I definitely suggest, doing your own research. It's pretty easy. I find some easy ways to actually find a lot of good research is often going to Wikipedia pages and going down to the works cited and then seeking out those works and other works by those authors, or even looking at scholars related to some of those other scholars as well. But, so what we're talking here is we're talking about Japan and its relation with Korea, specifically South Korea. So let's get into this. So starting in the mid to late 19th century, there is some turmoil between Korea and Japan. There's like different treaties that were signed, and it all was kind of leading up to then in 1910 when Japan would annex Korea. For those who don't know what that means, annexing is when another country assumes land or sometimes a whole country. We often hear this referred to in World War II when we talk about Germany annexing, Belgium, France, essentially taking over these other lands and claiming it as part of your own. For those who don't know a lot about Japan's history, through the 19th and early 20th centuries, Japan was really starting to expand their empire and really was interested in conquest and taking more in. For a long time, Japan had kind of an interesting relationship with some of the countries around it, specifically China. You just have this long history that a little too complex to go into here, but just you need to understand Japan was beginning to expand their empire and they invaded and annexed Korea. At this point, Korea is one nation, it's not North and South. Under the annex, Japan forced all Koreans to, convert to their religion. Prior to World War II, or I guess the end of World War II really, in Imperial Japan, the emperor was seen as being as a divine figure, often being considered a living god. So by forcing Koreans to adopt their religious practices, they just weren't saying, oh, you got to pray to our gods. Like, you have to pray to our emperor. Often when other countries will colonize another one, that is a big thing that tends to happen, is you tend to want to go after the smaller, or not necessarily the smaller, but the people you've conquested. You try to force them to your religion. This is something the Romans did a lot, because if you can force people to adopt your religion, then you can have a state religion, and then that can help unify the the entire nation. And in this case, Japan, by, saying that their emperor was divine, which is, they didn't start saying it for this situation, something that has been said or used to be said for, centuries. But, it helps kind of almost in a way help justify the actions by saying, oh, our emperor is a living god, therefore it is our divine right to conquer you. We're not going to get into all that kind of mess, but, basic things to understand here. So from 1910 to 1945, Korea was annexed by Japan and was pretty much forced to take on a lot of their cultural and religious beliefs and customs. So by forcing them, they really are trying to make them into part of Japan. That's a big part when you're trying to expand your empire and add people into under your subjugation, is you want them to identify with, the new mother country, if you will. Due to how World War II ended, though, with, Japan losing, there was some mess. There was a lot of mess. The country of Korea was divided into North and South because the US controlled what is now known as South Korea, and the Soviets from Soviet Russia were controlling the North. This would eventually lead to the creations of both North and South Korea, and all of kind of being not all of the basis, but being a lot of the bases for kind of the issues between those nations now. Like I said before, during World War II, Japan was annexing most, as much as they could of Eastern Asia, with the goal of controlling it, if not trying to take over, all of Asia. Like I mentioned before, this is very similar to what the Germans were doing in World War II. So like I said, this is just kind of a brief history. A lot of nuance and a lot of details are missing, but pretty much what you need to know is Japan occupied Korea from 1910 to 45, so about a 30-ish year period, forced their customs and beliefs on them, and to this day there are still kind of repercussions of Japan's actions that are still being felt in that country, even if some of those issues are more like indirectly related. The next, as you probably have noticed, upcoming expansion pack is inspired by Japanese culture. I've seen some people saying it's like Asian culture. From what I can tell, it is specifically Japanese. The Sims team has said it's a Japanese inspired pack. And, while it is true that a lot of Eastern Asian countries like China, Japan, and the Koreas do share a lot of, cultural similarities and cultural norms, they're all very different in their own rights. I think a lot of people tend to lump them, especially here in the Western world, America and Western Europe. I think we tend to lump that world together, like that part of the world, Eastern Asia. And while it's true, like I said, there are similarities, they're all very different. I like to compare it to how a lot of European, especially Western European nations, share a lot in common when it comes to, religious beliefs, cultural norms, how they set up their laws, their courts. There's a lot of similarity, a lot of cultural similarities as well, but they're all still very nuanced and different. But what you need to understand here is this is a Japanese-inspired pack, and with that comes a lot of cultural things. One of those things is they have brought in, at least in the trailer, an interaction for the Sims that looks like they're interacting with an object that's based off of Shinto shrines and worshiping. This is, Shintoism is a very big part of Japanese culture. Many Korean players, though, have expressed being upset or uncomfortable due to the fact that Japan forced Koreans to take upon this practice when they occupied the Koreas. However, before we get a little further, I just think there's some things we need to put down. I'm not here to invalidate anyone's feelings. I often like to tell people your feelings are valid, but that doesn't always mean they're justified. I'm never going to tell someone they're not allowed to be upset, that they're not allowed to be angry. However, that doesn't always mean your feelings have been earned, if that makes sense. Another thing to remember here is cultural practices, imagery can have different meanings depending on what culture they're interacting with. I'll get a little bit more into that. But, in Japan, one of the major religions, like I said, is Shintoism. It is like the second largest religion. And praying to these shrines is a very common practice. So I totally understand why the Sims team added this. But on the other hand, I understand why Korean people might be upset or view this as insensitive, because this was an element that was forced upon them, that was not part of their culture, that they do not view as something positive. But I just want to reiterate, this is a Japanese inspired pack. So yes, while I understand why they're upset, I don't necessarily think that it's fully earned, if that makes sense. Once again, I don't want anyone to feel bad for being upset. I'm just trying to, I guess, maybe add some context here. But I think all of this, to me, really highlights an interesting thing that happens when, like I said, you have things that in one culture are seen as very good, positive, and then in another culture, sometimes one that's very close to them, might not feel the same way. I'm going to make a kind of loose example here, and that's, many people who subscribe to the Christian faith, or whatever denomination that may be, often believe that Christianity kind of encompasses everything that's good. And they view, Christian and Christian iconography as like a good thing upon the world. However, this is not true for everyone. Many indigenous people here in the United States, at least, who were able to hold on to their cultural beliefs and rights and attitudes, do not view Christianity as like this purely good thing. They often see it, connected with imperialism, connected with the colonization and the genocide of their people. So, there's an example of, people who've grown up in societies with Christianity and have adopted it and, are in that faith more often than not, tend to view it as this good thing. They view, the message of Christ being positive and great, And then on the flip side, though, you got people who have had this forced upon them who do not feel the same way and identify it not as its own thing, but identify it in relation to something that's pretty negative. And once again, I would never tell anyone who viewed Christianity this way that they were wrong, or that that they weren't allowed to feel upset. I might not think it's a fair view on Christianity as a whole, but I understand why they would come to that conclusion, especially since a lot of colonialism used religion as like a scapegoat to kind of, justify it, the same as we see with the Koreans being invaded by Japan. It was the Japanese who were putting out this idea that it was like their divine right. However, though, I do think we need to talk about that. I don't think EA has done anything wrong here. I totally understand why Korean people can see this and be upsetting. That to them is not a good thing. They don't view Shintoism necessarily as a pretty positive thing. They're going to view it as something kind of negative. However, in Japan, like I said, it's the first largest religion, I believe, Buddhism being the second largest. So, it's a huge part of that culture, those cultural beliefs. So it makes sense you would tie it into a pack inspired by Japan. So while I understand why they're upset, I don't think it's necessarily fair to ask EA to remove it or to tell the members at EA they've done something wrong, especially since this is a Japanese themed pack. I could maybe understand the arguments if this was a Korean themed pack or a general Asian inspired pack. However, this is, as the team said, specifically Japanese inspired. The next issue that we're going to talk about is regarding a design seen on a kimono in the trailer. There's this little design on it that looks very similar to the rising sun flag of Japan. For those who don't know, Japan is referred to as the land of the rising sun, so sun imagery has been extremely frequent in their culture and in their art. However, a concern is being raised here over a design that vaguely kind of looks like it might be referring the rising sun flag, which you're like, you might not understand why that's a bad thing, and I'll explain. Some context for this flag, though, is from 1603 to 1868. There was, this flag was seen as the national flag for Japan. And then in 1870, it was adopted as the war flag of the Japanese Imperial Army, and then a few years later also adopted for the Navy. This flag is what they flew as they invaded Korea and other nations and would assume them into their empire. In recent years, this flag has actually been a piece of contention for many. Many people have come forward, both Japanese, some Korean, some people just familiar with the culture, have come forward and have, spoken about kind of the problematic history of this flag and why it shouldn't still be on display. Because, even though it's no longer the official flag of the nation, it's still, I believe, used in their army. It's still, I believe, used as a cultural item. Many people, hang them and own them. As you will learn, this is not necessarily a flag that a lot of people think is worth defending. In 2013, University of Alberta alum and Korean-Canadian citizen Dong-Woo Kim wrote an article where he argued why no one should be flying this flag anymore. In his article, he wrote, "Would you ever wear a t-shirt with a swastika on it? Assuming you were a right-minded person with a good sense of decency, you would not. Swastikas represent a political regime that committed horrible acts upon many, to the extent that it became a symbol of crime against humanity and ultimately, and rather ironically, contributed to the furthering of human rights as an essential political discourse in the post-World War II world. A swastika is not only offensive to the Jewish people, but to everyone, for it is an insult to the very ideals that we hold sacred, that every human life is deserving of respect. But this society that abhors Nazis does not hold the same standard for the images of the Japanese rising sun, which is, in a way, even more offensive than swastikas." Essentially, what this author is arguing is that this symbol is equal to, if not worse, in his mind, to the swastika that were held by the Nazis who committed actual genocide. There was also horrendous crimes committed by the Japanese people against the Korean people. I'm not going to go into all of them here. They're really dark, and I think if you're interested in knowing that history, you can definitely go and read it. It's very upsetting, some of the things that happened. But, that was from 2013. Do people still feel the same way? Well, actually, in January of this year, before, Corona came and ruined everything, The BBC published an article that highlighted some issues regarding this flag when South Korean politicians called for the rising sun flag to be banned at the 2020 Olympics Games. The Games ultimately got postponed to 2021 due to COVID-19 though. The Games are to be held in Tokyo, and it's very common for Japanese citizens to wave this flag at sporting events. Like I said, even though it's not the official flag anymore of Japan, many people still hold on to it and see it as like a nationalistic symbol in some ways. The 2020 Olympic organizers responded to these requests saying that they had no plans to ban the flag and maintained the belief that the flag is not a political statement. I have an issue with this statement solely because even if Japan hadn't used that flag as a war flag when they invaded and conquered many other people and committed horrendous crimes, it would still be political. I don't think there are any national flags that aren't inherently political. So I think that's kind of a weak argument, but, I digress. For those who are having a trouble time maybe grappling why this flag might be seen so negatively, I think a kind of comparable example would be to discuss the Confederate flag here in the United States and a lot of the discussions that have been happening here in the US regarding the Confederate flag. Many US citizens view the Confederate flag as a symbol of racism and white supremacy. And I generally agree with them. In Germany, where actually swastikas and Nazi imagery is banned, a lot of neo-Nazis living in Germany actually don the Confederate flag. Yikes. But so many US citizens understand that this Confederate flag is a negative thing. And if the team were to add it into the game, with many people, would be upset. So you can see why many people, with the idea of this flag even being introduced, even vaguely, you can understand why people might be upset. But what does this mean for the design seen on one of the kimonos? While I agree the flag of the rising sun in its pure form probably has no place in our current world, I don't think we should be throwing out any kind of sun designs. Like I mentioned before, this is the land of the rising sun, and even their current flag pays homage to that idea, and a lot of their art and imagery uses a lot of sun ideas. So the idea that you can't employ sun and sun-like imagery onto these clothing simply because they might fall too close to the rising sun flag, I don't think is a fair assessment. The piece also in mind that people are questioning, I personally don't think it looks enough like it. I see where they're coming from. However, to that I say the design of the original flag that we're talking about here was a very basic design. I think, anyone who draws a sun with lines out of it could be accused of drawing that symbol if you really wanted to. So I personally don't think this design is really close enough to discuss whether or not this is an issue. However, once we see more of the create a sim items and build and buy, we'll really be able to understand if they employed any of the rising sun imagery. However, once again, I think if you're doing a world inspired by Japanese culture and don't employ any kind of sun, it just kind of feels like you're missing something, if that makes sense. However, though, at the end of the day, as a white, non-Korean, I really have no right to tell anyone, especially a Korean person, that they can't be upset about this. If they are upset, I definitely, your feelings are valid. You're allowed to be upset. However, I don't really think the Sims team has inherently done anything wrong here. Like I said, at the end of the day, this is a Japanese-inspired world with Japanese-inspired culture. So if we're gonna do that culture and that imagery, of course, we're gonna come up to things, like the Shinto prayer worship areas and the Japanese, sun and that kind of inspiration and imagery in that culture. So I don't know. Like I said, people who are upset by it, I don't want them to feel like I don't care for them. But I think for me, I just am wondering if it's fair to be expecting the Sims team to fix this. I know not everyone who is speaking on this is asking for the Sims team to fix it. I have seen some comments here and there saying that the Sims team should remove these aspects from the upcoming pack. I don't think that's necessarily fair to Japanese culture though. However, you personally might not be interested in what's fair to them. I think another point though I do want to bring up is another quote from Dong-Woo Kim's article, where he writes, "The rising sun flag was the symbol of the Empire of Japan during late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is extremely easy to find the images of the rising sun on t-shirts, restaurants, films, TV, etc. In a way, we cannot blame the people who use this image. Everyone knows that Adolf Hitler and his administration committed atrocities against humanity. But comfort women, Maruta, and the rape of Nanking aren't concepts that are taught in public schools, at least with the same degrees of importance as the Holocaust." As he's explaining here, essentially what it comes down to is a lot of people aren't quite aware of this history, and it's because the public education system doesn't seem to be as interested, for whatever reason, in speaking about the atrocities that were committed versus, talking about the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Ultimately, the issue of Japanese colonization and its effects on the current countries it's just not, discussed. And I feel like this has a huge role into understanding why so many sim players are not only unaware of this issue, but also why the ones who are aware are more upset. I don't feel like the Sims team has done anything wrong, though. I think they did their best to honestly depict an inspiration of Japanese culture. What I'm hoping comes out of this, though, is that the Sims team sees that their Korean base are a little upset. And while I don't think necessarily creating a world inspired by Korean culture would fix all the issues, but it would be a great way to really showcase what makes, Korea different from Japan. And remind all players that at the end of the day, every culture is uniquely different. Even ones that share cultural ideas, share some things that look visually similar. At the end of the day, Japan and Korea are not the same, and they have different cultural values and are, culturally different, even with the similarities. However, at the end of the day, I do understand why people are upset, and I'm not going to tell them they're not allowed to be upset. If you're upset by this, I support you being upset. However, I need you to know that I don't think it's fair necessarily to put a lot of blame on the Sims team, especially since, their goal was to create a Japanese-inspired world, and they did that. Of course, when this pack comes out, we'll be able to maybe understand a little bit more of what's going on here. I do have a fear that we might see a lot of the images from the rising sun flag maybe here and there on this, if that's the truth. While I'll understand that they probably don't know the difference and don't know the history behind that specific flag, it'll make me wonder why they didn't do more research. And I think ultimately, at the end of the day, one thing to take away from here, once again, is understanding that just because something in one culture is seen as good doesn't mean it's seen as good in another. However, I don't think it's fair then to blankly state it's bad, especially when we're getting into some pretty sticky conversations, especially around religion. I think when you start telling someone that their religion shouldn't be depicted, it's a little tricky. Like I said, that specific design that's being brought up in conversation, I don't think it looks enough like the Japanese rising sun flag to be too concerned. However, there is a part of me that is ultimately concerned that we're gonna see that flag or something inspired by that flag here. And, even, regardless of, how Korean people feel, I stand with other people in the sense that that flag doesn't have much space here in the current world. I don't think it should be flown. Anytime a flag is used to commit atrocities, or atrocities are committed flying under a certain flag, I think that flag is tarnished. I don't see it as a sign of nationalism, personally, to fly that flag. However, I know not everyone agrees with me. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. I know it's a very not fun one. Hopefully this doesn't upset anyone. For those, who are upset by this, I want you just to understand, I do stand with you. I understand why you're upset. I don't, think it's necessarily fair to go after the Sims team, because I think at the core of this issue comes down to, that many people are still living in the shadow of, Japanese colonization and all the negative effects that came with that, as well as there's just not enough public knowledge on this subject to keep a lot of people more aware. But ultimately, even if the Sims team is aware of all of these, I do not fault them for adding those elements. Specifically, the Shinto one, I do not blame them for adding that. That's a huge part of Japanese culture. However, like I see, once we get the game, we will understand then how much of the rising sun flag has been used in the imagery. So let me know down below. Is this a topic you've been following? Do you know about it? Let me know if I've inspired you to maybe go out and do a little bit more of your own research. As well as, let me know down below what your 2 cents on it. Try to be kind. I don't want to see any name calling. Ultimately, like I said, things to remember here. Everyone's entitled to their feelings. Your feelings are valid. They're not always justified, but your feelings are your own, and I'm not going to tell you your feelings are wrong. And another thing to remember, what we understand in one culture is good, not always going to be this good in another. And the last point is, we just need to be kind to each other. Nothing's going to get, done properly if we go in the comments and start calling people names because they're upset about this or not upset about this. So let's try to be open-minded and think about this as adults. Another thing I do want to just end this video on is my feelings on this might change. In a few weeks, I might, decide that, this isn't my current opinion. If I change my opinion, I'll try to come on here and let you guys know, so that way you can be more up to date in the conversation I want to have here. But ultimately, that's another thing I just want to put out there. It's okay for your opinion to shift. If you say, these shouldn't be in the game. In a few weeks, change your mind. It's like, you know what? It's fine. That's okay. If you say right now, hey, this seems fine, but in a few weeks, change your mind, that's also okay. Being human is about growth. And no matter which way you grow or how you grow, you're still growing. Anyways, thank you for watching this video. And I hope to see you in the next one. And please don't kill me. I'm sorry.